Many people regard you as a personification of Ubuntu. What do you understand Ubuntu to be?
In the old days when we were young, a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? These are the important things in life. And if one can do that, you have done something very important which will be appreciated.
From WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network, the open source report on the 14th of September 2017. What we've done is we've integrated our technical report, the open source report, our political report, Boston Red, and Numbers Man, the macroeconomics feature into our Boston Red network, and you'll see these changes and all of the outlets. Now, for the open source report, you can get it on iHeartRadio now, on Stitcher, Spreaker, and various other outlets out there that are available to us, and we'll be adding to more. Now, we will add this particular report to the Android part. We'll still you need to check iTunes and see exactly where we are with iTunes, but the RSS feed should be working properly there. And as normal, Crescent Software is sponsoring this. This is MA here. And the stable kernel is 4.13.1, and is the latest stable kernel. Let me get that right. And the long-term kernel, the one we're using on our Slackware system, is 4.9.49, I believe it is. There, it perhaps may upgrade today, but that is the kernel that we are using. We'll talk about several things today. The Equifax problems with Strouts, and what occurred there at Equifax. It's a disgrace. We'll go to Mr. Krebs in that report, and he'll talk about what happened in Argentina with the login password. Anyway, that thing does happen out there occasionally. And we'll look at the newest desktop operating system from the Gomi people called Manchester. And from the Android people, this is Android 8, otherwise known as Oreo. And what they are doing there to harden the kernel, we'll talk about it. This is a major development. And much of our work here at Cranston has always been around the kernel. And with our Android work, it's been around the kernel also. Android had been behind in their kernel versions, which Android is a very interesting system. It is from Google. It's partially open source. It's not entirely open sourced, but now they're coming with the latest kernel. And let's just go to it first while we are doing this. This is from Gizmos. Android Oreo adds the Linux kernel requirements and debuts Project Turboli, I suppose is how you pronounce it. Anyway, we'll put that on the link to this show. Android 8 is what's out there. Project Turboli update plan. New Android 8 devices will run Linux 4.4 later. plus Oreo and the Linux 4.13 beefed up security. So this is the whole thing around security. The Linux kernel continues to add security protection, so developers don't have to build them on their own. As a result, one of the first steps security experts recommend for protection against embedded Linux malware threats is to work with the latest possible kernel releases and then regularly update. And this is the same thing that is to Strauss. Strauss is the framework used at Equifax. Now the Android is getting long in the tooth. It's 9 years old this month, and the founders there, I suppose, rode in on rollerblades. Anyway, that doesn't matter that much. Android devices are being attacked due to out-of-date Linux kernels. To address the problem, before it adds to Android's substantial challenge with malware, it should be malware, generates from rogues or unprotected apps. Google has announced new requirements in the Android 8, that is, to use Linux kernels no older than 4.4. Now, the new requirements, which were revealed last week, the launch of Android 8 are intended to support its Project Tumbly technology for speeding firmware updates. Oreo has also backported several kernel hardening features, including upstream Linux kernel. In the coming years, Google may well tap security enhancements built in to this week's release for 4.13, the 13th version of the kernel 4X, updating SBM support and adding transport layer security there. So some things they are adding here. Google's first minimal Linux kernel requirement for Android were posted last week on the Android source page and revealed by Doug Lynch at the XDA developers. The new SoC that ships in 2017 or later, and that appears on Android 8 devices must have, as we said before, 4.4 for Linux, or a higher kernel that is really Oreo-based product. With older SoCs must start with Linux 3.18. There's no requirement for recent Linux kernel on older devices that are upgrading to Oreo without any requirement. In the requirement page, regardless of launch date, all SoCs with device launched on Android all remain subject to kernel changes. So this is one of the things that they're trying to do. Project Tumbly is implemented via a new vendor interface, and this is very important here, validated with vendors test suite, VTS. These tools give the silicon makers a more detailed required specs for booting into new Android devices. Android 8, Oreo, what do you want to call it? The Oreo, they are not a cookie, but anyway, recent Linux kernels have added kernel hardening. We've been talking that for a very, very long time, as revealed in the Android developers blog. 8 backports for these features from upstream Linux kernels ranging 4.4 to 4.8. I haven't checked our old Android device to see what is on it. It's a disgrace. The key improvement is 4.4 kernel addresses space layout randomization, which randomizes the location where the kernel code is loaded in each boot. One of the implementations of 4.8 hard user copy schemes which protects user copy functions that help transfer data between the user space and the kernel memory. So all these things are there. And if you are buying a new device, just remember to check the kernel version on it. And if you have 8.0, they're more and more available now. Google Play Protection logo, that's one security enhancements there. Performs improvements including 2.5 times faster boot up time coming out there. So some of the things here this week, the 4.13 kernel release extends the trend of adding security functionality. At Linux.com, there's a story there. Server message blocks, won't go much into that, but nonetheless, 4.13 adds support for transport layer security. We talked about it, TLS, the successor to Secure Socket Layer, SSL. Anyway, moving into more modern times, which is good. There's also support for Intel's upcoming Coffee Lake. That is the eighth generation Core CPU that will succeed Kobe Lake while retaining in the same 14 nanometer foundation. Let's see. 4. Also added some for the next generation, which are now going to 10 nanometers Cannon Lake architecture. That'll be due out late in 2018. I remember when these were 32 nanometers. Anyway, in other words, basically what's happening is getting thinner and thinner. Period. And for the Pi's, Nano Pi, new native support for several ARM hacker boards here, and Orange Pi, Orange Pi Prime, and 0+2, and several of them here that have come upon the scene. Now, Tripoli. This is their blog here, updates. I think we basically covered Trebly separates the vendor implementation there from the Android OS framework, new vendor interface, and how it is done. Android 7X and earlier, no formal vendor interface, so the device maker had to upgrade. In other words, large portion of the Android code. That will not happen now under the new stable vendor interface, provided access to hardware specified parts of Android, enabling the device maker to deliver new Android releases simply by updating the Android OS framework. And this is something new, and some tools are added. We'll put this up. We won't really spend very much time on it. But let's go back here to the new desktop, Manchester, from Gummy 3.26. It is coming. People think of a Linux-based system. Incidentally, this is also the desktop used on Ubuntu. So in other words, let's see. For Linux users and others, a desktop environment is sort of the operating system, if it's how they interact with their computers, etc. Anyway, under the hood, many Gummy 3 is their preferred environment. For good reason. It's beautiful, it's intuitive, It's getting better all the time. Today's 3.26. Manchester is chock full of improvements, no doubt. System searches have been improved in the system, as I should say that, and it's been around for 20 years, incidentally, in the Linux and BSD environments. Today, the project 2.26 introduces a new layout to setting applications. The previous grid of icons is gone, which is good. The sidebar allows switching between different areas. The new sidebar will make it easier and quicker to navigate the setting applications. That's one of the things they have needed to do for a long time. Windows smoothly transitions when they are maximized and unmaximized, etc. The size of the Windows thumbnails have been increased in activity overview. The top bar becomes transparent when they aren't minimized. Some of these you really not sure who is into that, but anyway. And various other calendar contacts. All this sort of housekeeping here. Improvements. Maps have a collection of small improvements. When you resize a file in disk, it's now possible to resize its partition, and that is something new. Used to on the Windows applications systems, you had to use usually a third party. Now there's some resizing built into Windows. Things are out there. Let's see. The tweets have been renamed. The Tinker have been renamed to tweets. Has gained 3 new settings, switches, etc. Battery. These are more housekeeping things with Gomi there, but Gomi, what is it? Gomi 3.26 become available on your favorite distribution on Ubuntu. They say you won't have to wait very long. For those of us on things like Slack, where we'll have to download it and build it. Yeah, for let's see, Ubuntu was at 17.10. It'll be out next month, so it'll be the default setting there. So in other words, a movie. This is from Beta News, where we were looking at this. Let's move on here. We'll put this one up too. Linux Zen installation. That's been around for a while. To run it as a standard system, it's a LabVirt to manage your virtual clients, VCs. For the virtual ability, you can add a Zen to Linux, and we'll just put this up. Won't go much into how it is set up, other than to say that on Slack, where it's a bit of a challenge, we looked at it for Red Hat and CentOS 7. Anyway, how to perform it. Pretty easy to get it done there, and you can set up your virtual environment, which is a good thing. There are ways also of doing this, and I won't get into those today. One other thing while we're here with Facebook, 5 reasons Facebook React license was a mistake. Now, this is Facebook's BSD patent license combo failed not to become part of the license itself because it ignored the deep nature of open source. This is by opensource.com and Simon Phillips. The Apache Foundation effectively banned the license combining Facebook has been applying to all of its projects. It's been releasing as open source using a free clause BSD license, a widely used open source initiative, approved non-reciprocal license, combined with a broad non-reciprocal patent grant, but with equity, broad termination rules to frustrate aggressors. The combination represents a new open source license, which I term the Facebook BSD Plus patent licensure, and to my eyes it bears the hallmark of an attempt to be compatible with GS2. That's the GPL2 and the Apache license version 2 at the same time, circumventing the alleged incompatibility of those licenses. The use of the license by the Apache project is still in play, but the reason I believe Facebook has made a mistake may not be immediately obvious to even the most pragmatic software developers. For example, coder Dennis Walsh said of the issue, there's no there. He is pointing to the combo affects only the use of a particular software project you are using to which it's applied, and the consequences withdrawal of the patent grant are exceptionally unlikely due to serious for other patent holders. He concludes, Facebook wants to make open source software and not be sued. Noble goal, and maybe Nimble also. To the end of they've used some harsh clauses, but in the case for the particular and legal reason outlined above, it's hard to find any teeth behind the bite. Dennis is probably right, but beside the point, Facebook's rookie mistake of inventing its own open source license is always a bad idea. It is indeed a bad idea, and this is one of the problems in the open source movement with these libertarian-prone operations. The use of a non-OSI approved license mean legal review is always required for corporate use, and that can be a big problem. Less permission in advance. It's not just the license approval that matters. Any kind of uncertainty concerning the freedom to innovate gets in the way of developers waiting to use the code. For the same reason, public domain is bad for developers. Using the term that requires a permission to be sought before proceeding chills adoption. By adding a Facebook-specific legal document to the project, every corporate developer will now need to reach out to legal advisors. And as Aaron Williamson points out, that may not be their reaction. On even playing field, the parent giant Facebook uses gave it and no one else in the project special rights and protection. That makes open source developers nervous for the same reason as a combination agreement do. The whole value of software freedom is to adopt an open source project. It creates a safe space where everyone is equal and protection for everyone else's motivations. Carving out extra rights for you alone is sociopathic. I agree there with him. Implied grant void. Many open source legal authorities believe that by granting permission to use software for any purpose, every license with no mention of the parent's giant and implied parent license, by adding any form of external patent grant, Facebook indicates it does not believe that the grant at best is sufficient or at worst exists. Lawyers who specialize in open source see see as an unwarranted escalation by Facebook. A period there. Apache rules, although I have not been able to find a clear and complete rationale. Apache appears to have ruled against the Facebook license combo because Facebook has a parent grant Apache considers more restrictive than the one in the Apache license 2. Now, Apache has a separate license from the general license anyway. And when they went from being just a basic web server to many, many projects, including the one we'll be talking about in a minute here, it makes no sense to argue because the risk is small, the matter is trivial. Behaving in a way that ignores the community's norms and so forth. There. Anyway, Simon Phillips has a very good Stutz, incidentally, which we'll be talking about, is a project under a very broad umbrella of the Apache project. So, in other words, there are many, many things under there. Let's get to it. When we leave, we have a little from Johan and company talking about the breach over at Equifax. Now let's see here. This is so we'll make sure we get on right. Network security news summary. They do that daily here with the compromise, and they'll go into much more detail on that there. There's also from the SAMS people, Infosax Forum, modern web applications penetration testing, hash length extension attacks. Now this is let's see, Ron Bowers. Anyway, the content and the state of web applications penetration testing in general. He mentioned the hash length extension attack, and this is something that Johan and company also talk about here. And he had coincidentally written the absolute best to exploit them. Ron has also done a write-up for capture flags, and the tool is the hash extender. And we have some ingredients that we talk about. We have a topic. Let me just a minute here. And this is one that comes from Johan and company, also the hash extender. We found vulnerable applications also include some other interesting cryptographic challenges called crypto OMG. This is from Spider Labs. They published solution to the first and second challenge on their blog, and we'll go ahead and include this as you can look at it anyway. Appears to be a local file included, the LFI. Won't get into too much of this, but how to do some penetration testing here. The hash mark situation, it really just lays it out, so we'll move quickly from it. Now, let's move on here. Some security week. This is on the 6th. The latest, this is the Apache, Struts 2, and addresses several vulnerabilities, including a remote code execution flaw from which an exploit was created within hours after release of a patch. Now, again, this Struts is a free and open source framework designed for creating modern Java web applications. The framework is reportedly used by at least 65% of the Fortune 100 companies. They could all be exposed to attack due to a recent discovered security hole. One of the problems is when you publish these, people immediately get to it. All versions of Apache Struts is released since 2008. So that's almost 10 years. Are affected by severe vulnerabilities related to REST, the communications plugin group. Anyway, here, and let's see what we got going here. More updates. The framework is used by an incredibly large number and variety of organizations. The vulnerability poses a huge risk because the framework is typically used for designing public accessible web applications like the one at Equifax. And the advice here is upgrade your components immediately. And this is one of the big problems here. If you go to the release is the full release of Struts is 2.5.13, and we have put that up. Apache is the latest, I believe. Yeah, it is. So this is where that is taken care of. Let me make sure I got this right on the version numbers here. Yeah, 2.5.13. This is on September the 7th, and we'll get sort of line these up here. Make certain that we get the latest one up. It is September the 7th, 2017. A general availability of 2.3.34. So that is where the project is, and we need to get past this. And the BBC has another Equifax. We talked about Argentina using the login password, and we'll get to Mr. Brian Krebs in a second here. Said that the online employees tool used in the country could be accessed by typing admin. He added that this gave access to records that included thousands of customer national identity numbers. Last week, the firm revealed a separate attack affected millions in the U.S. Yeah, there's roughly people that actually paid Equifax for this. I think there's about 12,000 people that fell into that. Now, this is in addition to the hundreds of thousands that were stored there. And it was also an issue there with the certificates. I mean, this is... but wait, it gets worse. He blogged this. We'll go to Brian's situation in a minute here. From the main page, Equifax.com, an employees portal was listing some of the 115 pages worth of complaints and disputes filed by Argentines who at one point over the past decade contacted Equifax. Now, the site also lists every person's DNI document, national identidad. This is the Spanish there. There were 14,000 such records, according to Mr. Krebs, concluding that the firm had been sloppy. And you find a lot of sloppy base. But one cyber expert in the UK agrees the case has risen questions about Equifax protecting the data it holds. Well, it's sloppy. I wouldn't deal with Equifax. Now, this is from Mr. Krebs here. Equifax last week disclosed a historical breach involving Social Security numbers, etc., of 143,000 Americans. The company said the breach also impacted an undisclosed number of people in Canada and the UK, but the official list of victim countries may not yet be complete, according to information obtained by Krebs on Security. Equifax can safely add Argentina to the list. Well, the list just continues to grow. Is one of the largest one of the world's largest free consumer credit reporting agencies. That's what it is. Today, the author contacted Alex Holder. He's a founder. He's in Milwaukee of Holder Security. There, Holder's a team of 30 or so workers, including 2 native Argentines, who spent some time examining the site there. It took almost no time for them to discover that the online portal designed to let Equifax workers in Argentina manage credit reports, disputes from customers in that country used the open and protected, perhaps the easiest to guess, the administrative admin. That is something else. Anyway, once inside the portal, the researchers found they could view the names of more than 100 Equifax workers in Argentina, as well as IDs and email addresses. A search of Equifax that indicated the unit currently has approximately 111 workers. Veraz is the name of that. Anyway, however, all one needs to do is to view said passwords, to right-click on the worker's profile page and select View Source. Buried in HTML code was the employee's password in plain text. Oh boy. A review of these accounts all showed all employee passwords were the same as each user name. This is amazing. I mean, I've not seen this. I've been around a long time. Anyway. But wait, it gets worse. So from the main page of Equifax.com, Argentina Employees Portal was a listing of, this is the 715 pages worth of complaints. All of that was there. We'll just put Mr. Krebs' article on here. I mean, this is amazing. Anyway, according to Equifax's own literature, the company has operations and consumer customers in several other countries in the Americas: Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, Uruguay, Peru. Is unclear where they are. To me, is just negligence. That's from Mr. Holder of Milwaukee. I don't have much advice for Argentines whose data has been exploited by sloppy security at Equifax. I mean, there are lawsuits swirling all around Equifax. So, what more can you say? I mean, Krebs, we'll put a link there now. What's the latest? Adobe and Microsoft both on Tuesday released patches to plug critical security vulnerabilities in their products. Windows operating system and related software vulnerabilities there. Flash has been, that's Adobe's product, has had so many problems there. Let's see. The 0-day flaws are being fixed this week. One of Microsoft's .NET framework is perhaps the most concerning, despite the flaw being actively exploited. It's also something labeled by Microsoft as an important rather than a critical update. More than 24 flaws. This is Microsoft remedies with this patch anyway. So in other words, Microsoft is still patching various things out there. This .NET separate from any remaining Windows updates, mainly because it's past instances in which I've experienced problems installing Windows updates. A .NET patch was usually involved. For the most part, Microsoft now bundles all security updates together in one big patch ball, no longer letting people choose which patches to install. So, in other words, they've set up like that, and in Windows 10, they just automatically update you there. And let's see, what else have we got here? I think we pretty much... You've got to hate what this is from Gizmo, just admitted about the security breach. Well, I think we covered most of what they just admitted, but they're admitting it to different people. It's a backup to the Apache Struts framework. That's Java-based applications there. Is popular in financial institutions. A month after vulnerability there. Explain to me why we need powerful, unaccountable financial institutions that are allowed to stockpile huge amounts of exploitable data, and away they go. Equifax evidently is hiring fraud experts. I wouldn't doubt it. Senators want to talk to them about it, and there's ever a rumor some officials at Equifax sold a stock. While some are recommending credit freezes in the wake of gigantic Equifax data breach. Well, if your reporting agencies are having problems, you really got big problems, because they are supposedly a guarding agency. They offer or sell so-called consumer updates, and whether you've been hacked or someone has used your credit, but now you can't trust them. So that in itself, that was by Tom McKay, about Equifax and its troubles. It's all I can say is just pathetic. What else can we say? And from ARS Technica, failure to patch 2-month-old bug led to the massive. Well, that's not unusual. These departments usually don't patch things, but this goes beyond just a patch, and the Struts people have talked about that. They confirmed that was breached through an unidentified Apache Struts vulnerability. 2 days later, the Apache Foundation issued a statement saying it did not know one way or if the Struts vulnerability was involved. Now, in a separate Apache Struts vulnerability that was patched last week. Now, the Apache Struts is a framework for the. We already talked about that. Relying on the Apache Struts as they wait anyway. Up to now, Equifax had said only that criminals exploited the unspecified application vulnerability to the U.S. site to gain access. Now we know the flaw was in Apache Struts and has been fixed months before the breach. Well, what happened? They didn't fix the breach was the problem right there. So, in other words, we are having problems definitely. We'll now go to the presentation by two people there that did the presentation that we were talking about earlier here, and we'll get to them. what happens when you do a bunch of these. This is the network security news summary. Is a daily summary there from Johan and company there, and we'll attach that. I think this was.
Hey, good morning. Hello, welcome to the Friday, September 8th, 2007.
Yeah, this is what you'll be hearing September the 8th, 2007 on a Friday from the daily Stormcast Internet Storm Center. And it's a very good, we'll have a link to it, and it's daily. You should tune into it. They do a very good job there of working with this and having it out there. Now, this is Mark Hochberg. Offensive intrusion analysis on uncovering insiders with Fred Hunting and defense. Now, we talked about that, and this was where we had the hash extenders flaw. We looked at that, and it's Creative Commons attributive license reuse there, and okay, this is actually there when I did the Creative Commons thing. That is actually there. Cast, we use a Creative Commons license also. So that is one there, the hash mark. We'll put that up. Hope to get all this stuff up here in the order in which it is. This is on the SANS people here. I believe, hash extender, that is a tool out there that we'll put this up. Skull security, everything you need to know about hash length extender attacks, and grab the hash extender tool is at GitHub. So we'll put that up here and get all those little problems solved. Nonetheless, this will do it for the open source report, MA at Cranston, and we'll see you hopefully next week. We sort of missed a couple of them there, weeks of reporting, but we'll get better at it as we move along. With all the attacks there and the hardening going on, it just continues to go on, and one wonders about where we are sometimes in the ball game. But with very sloppy types of work, with your basic certificates, you want to keep those certificates up, especially if you have a larger site. You want to keep them up anyway. You don't want to have, and that's what happened to the Hillary server. The security certificates there were way past dated, and patches aren't kept up, that sort of thing. So those are some things you want to do. With Slackware, we every week we get the updates, when there are updates, that is, and it is updated and in pretty good shape. But we are not heavily trafficked, and that is one of the biggest problems that is out there. Anyway, we'll link all this stuff up together, and we'll talk to you later. Good day.
Affected versions are, Struts, despite years of issues like this, still has a significant amount of usage. We found that there were a total of 13.1 million downloads of Struts components from Central in the calendar year 2016, of about 2,000 different individual modules, and at least a quarter of those were of vulnerable versions, which make up about 35% of all the Struts downloads. So even despite the fact that this isn't the first high-profile Struts attack that's been exploited in the wild, it's still quite popular. It's somewhat not surprising, given that Struts itself is a framework, and it's not really simple to just switch off of it. It basically equates to rewriting your entire application, or at least the front end and significant part of the business logic flow needs to be rewritten to get off of something like Struts. So it's certainly a challenge for users.
Is that one of the reasons that people are still using Struts? Is it so embedded in their applications, it's hard to move off of it?
Yeah, that's exactly the reason. It's the application framework that drives all of the logic back and forth between the client and the server. And so changing that to something else, some other MVP pattern, is a significant forklift of the application. So we've seen lots of people try to contain it. I don't think many people are starting new applications on Struts these days, but as the numbers show, it still has a significant population out there.
I'm going to share my screen because we've got some data that you had pulled up, you and your team had pulled up. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing here? Can you see that on screen now?
Not yet. Yep. Okay. Yeah, that was the data that I just kind of went through. We see this a lot. We try to get the message out and help our customers make sure that, for projects that are using Struts, to make sure that you're using the right versions. And in this case, you need to get up to the latest and greatest Struts 2. This particular vulnerability does not affect Struts 1. However, Struts 1 has many high-profile, well-known remotely code exploits on their own. I'm not aware of any versions of Struts 1 that are, quote-unquote, safe to use at this point.
Brian, for those that aren't aware of the work that you've done with Central, can you give us a little bit of background on your affiliation with Central Repository?
I've always been a student. So, quite literally running IT ops for the Central Repository and, keeping scrapers at bay and making sure the machines keep running and keeping it secure and all those types of things.
Okay, great. When we're looking at the update that we had yesterday on remediation guidance, are there specific things that you're recommending that people do right now?
Yeah, the first thing, is obviously to find out if you're using one of the affected versions. Not all of the versions are vulnerable. There was a change sort of somewhat recently in the code path that introduced and or changed the way this exploit comes about. Obviously moving to the latest version of Struts and getting your application redeployed would be the preference. But unlike some previous Struts vulnerabilities, in this instance, there are a few configuration changes you can make potentially to swap out the parsers that are affected here to get at least a short-term fix. And there are ways to try and filter the input to look for expressions. If you scroll down, Mark, you can see some of the remediation advice that our team put together.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. Tell me when you can see the change there. Is that changing for you?
Yep.
Okay, there you go.
Right down here, the recommendation kind of highlights this, right? So, there are ways to swap out that parser. Depending on which version of Struts you're using, you can swap it out and get some, hopefully, immediate relief. But, what's unfortunate with this particular vulnerability, it seems like right about the same time that the disclosure went out, the proof of concept code got out. And I'm not sure how that happened exactly, but we've seen this before with other high-profile Struts things about 6 years ago, where, the Struts team did the right thing. They did the responsible disclosure. They fixed it, got it out there. And the attackers started exploiting it almost immediately. We've talked about this in the past, that the attackers often have the first mover advantage because it's easier to just simply start exploiting this by broadcasting it around the internet than it is to go patch your application and get it into production, right? So the meantime, the remediate in these types of scenarios is really key because almost immediately there were reports of people being exploited in the wild by this vulnerability.
Great, thank you. For those that are watching, if you go to the Sonatype blog, this is featured on the blog so that you can have all this information. Shannon, welcome. It looks like you got set up here.
Thanks. Yep, I'm set up.
Yeah. Shannon and I were talking last night, Brian, and I wanted to bring her on to talk from a practitioner standpoint.
So from a DevSecOps perspective, one of the things that we've looked at is trying to reduce the footprint. If you have this installed on a system and you're not using it, make sure to delete it because the system can become more vulnerable as a result of having it simply on the system. The second piece of the puzzle really is, if you need to make sure that you have time to change code or whatnot, adding a surflet filter to your application can assist in reducing your attack footprint. And then, finally, upgrading the application so that you can use a different version of Struts is really recommended. So I think those three pieces of the puzzle are really important, obviously from a much broader audience perspective. Also, scanning your front-end surface, making sure that you're not vulnerable to this particular vulnerability is absolutely critical. So if you don't have that capability, I think that using a tool similar to the one that Sonatype's providing is really imperative to look at your applications. I think, and then the final piece of the, the construct here is the third-party libraries that you might be using may also be introducing Struts into your environment without you necessarily knowing. And so it's really critical to ensure that you've looked at your code base and you understand your third-party libraries and what they're using as well.
Brian, that opens up another point here too, is how deep would the dependencies be that would actually be surfacing this kind of vulnerability?
Well, in a general case, they could be anywhere, as we saw with the Commons Collections one. That was certainly the case, where it was often very deep and or in the application server itself, and merely its presence, I think, in a line. So it's that, I suppose, but the fact that it is a framework makes it even harder to stamp it out. It's not a case that you can just go kick out some unused third-party dependency. In this case, it might literally shut down your application. But the other thing that's worth pointing out here is that obviously picking the better components and keeping track of those things is key. In cases like this, a defense in depth approach truly is really valuable, because this case it's exploiting, it's executing code as the application server, right? And so if you're running your application server in a lockdown as a lockdown user, while it's annoying, the damage may be contained. However, if this process is running as root, they get access to your system and can do whatever they want and hop off from there, right? So this is one of these cases where the process really matters, and the best practices for how you're actually running your application can have profound impacts when something like this comes along.
Sorry, Mark. I think that every team out there is actively doing what they need to be diligent across every company that I've heard. So just from a community perspective, I think that everybody's doing what they can. Building a understanding of this comes from actually understanding the vulnerability itself. And so, building your own auto router is something that some of the security practitioners out there are doing. And, I think that that's actually very useful in understanding how the vulnerability may play out against your environment.
Great. You had mentioned also in passing the application health check. Brian, that is a free tool, right, that we're providing to the community for things like this?
That's right. Yeah, you can get that on our website, and it runs it locally and then provides you a full bill of materials with all of the information that you saw earlier on the blog post.
Great.
For any vulnerability. So if you're using Struts, this may not be the only one that you have to deal with. This is just the latest one.
That's right. One of the things that we get as a question on this tool too, just to get it out front, are we sending any data to our servers? People are concerned about privacy of data and things like that.
Yeah, no, that was one of the factors when we built it. So we fingerprint all of the components and create basically one-way hashes of various elements of the things inside your application, and that's all that gets sent. We don't get your binaries, we don't get your source code or anything like that. So literally, it's just a bunch of hashes, and then we look them up. And so if we know what those hashes are, if we can do the match, we tell you what they are, and then we tell you what we know about it. But for example, if it's a hash of some internal jar, it's just a hash to us. We don't know what it is.
All right, cool. Shannon, as lead of DevSecOps pretty much in the world, I mean, that's what you do, traveling the world, talking about DevSecOps. When announcements like this happen, I mean, what goes through in your brain? I mean, do you think of it on a global scale? Do you think of internally first handling? Where does your mind go when an announcement like this happens?
I think it goes straight to the fact that I want safer software sooner, and this is a very serious issue. Struts was I have a deep appreciation of Struts and what it really can mean from the standpoint of an application. In my past, I had to clean up a major breach as a result of a Struts issue. And so I think that it's really critical to make sure that as a community, we understand how to eradicate this, share the knowledge, share the tools, share the understanding. And I think that that's where my head goes to immediately. I think, that knowledge, that understanding is really critical to bring back into your company. But primarily, from a DevSecOps Foundation perspective, I think that I am really interested in making sure that developers out there are understanding that there's deep empathy for the fact that these vulnerabilities are critical, and trying to eradicate them is no easy matter. And I think that it's also about, if you can do anything to mitigate it right away, that's actually the most important part of the puzzle.
Brian, when we look historically at an event like this, what's the long tail here? I mean, I'm seeing, say, Heartbleed as an example. There's still hundreds of thousands of publicly accessible Heartbleed instances out. What do you see going on with Struts 2 now? What do you anticipate will be happening?
I think that the people that are prepared to be able to swap this out and are formed will respond. I think we're going to see a new class of people who, for whatever reason, forgot about or missed the last stuff, that are suddenly becoming aware of this again. But given how hard it is to change something as fundamental as Struts, I'm not believing that we're just going to see this disappear overnight. The evidence shows, what was the number, 35% of all Struts downloads in 2016 were of vulnerable versions. And some of those versions have been vulnerable for 10 plus years, right? So I see it all the time when I go to conferences and I talk to people. There's always one or two people in the room who are using it and are completely unaware how risky that is. So, I think a lot of the vulnerabilities of late, especially in Struts, all kind of derive from the same root cause, which is the organal, the object graph notation language that Struts uses to evaluate expressions, similar to the code that was in Commons collection. There, the intent there is to be able to instantiate objects and execute them. That's why that stuff exists. And so a lot of these Struts 2 vulnerabilities are all just basically flavors of the same root problem, which is tricking the system into taking input and executing it. And in this case, they found a new avenue, which is to use the content type. Previous avenues were, other request passing parameters and things like that. So, there probably are ways to secure the systems to look for certain types of expressions where they don't belong, filtering, pre-filtering and things like that. And I think, if you're going to be stuck on Struts for a while, I think you need to start thinking, how can you, prevent this class of problem? Because this is just the latest vector for the same class of problem.
Shannon, anything on that?
No, I think he's totally right. I think that, we all have libraries and applications out there, regardless of what's going on. Understanding their attack surface is really critical. Doing things like attack maps, making sure that you have an understanding of your surface area and having mitigating controls is really necessary. It's really interesting. If you have a WAF, you can put in certain rules. You can use a servlet to be able to filter the applications. And I think that having some strategy is really important to understand how much you can leverage a component like this.
Right. It's obviously key to know what you have, like we talked about before, making sure you understand what that surface area actually is. It's shocking that we see so many people have simply no clue what's actually in their applications. So, knowledge is power in this case, and then being able to put those mitigating controls, comes from understanding what that surface area actually is.
Shannon, as we're closing up here, what do you want to see happen as a result of this? What's your recommendation? What are you hoping to see? How the community responds? What are you looking for?
Yeah, I think if you're a developer, primarily as a security practitioner, my guidance is to go out, take a look at your applications, understand its attack surface, understand how you've got your logging set up, ensure that you've gone through the security hierarchy of needs and you've got the right containment profile for an application that's using a library like this. And then ultimately making sure you have the right mitigation strategy to match your attack surface and your attack map. Doing so will have a profound effect on being able to deal with any of the 0 days that are out there.
Brian, it looks like you were nodding in agreement on a lot of things she was saying there.
Yeah, it's like I said before, it stems from understanding what's really inside your software. Without that, you can't do any of the things that Shannon's talking about. You can't really exploits might or things to be guarding against. So being able to understand that and then deal with it and then make better choices as you go forward is key. It's kind of what we're all about at Sonatype.
Okay, that's it from my end. Unless you two have something else you'd like to cover on this incident here.
No.
Great. Shannon, thank you for pulling over on the freeway there and giving us your time. Shannon's literally on the freeway in San Diego right now.
I'm actually off the freeway now, but yes.
Good, thank you. Brian, as always, good to talk to you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.
All right, thanks. Okay, bye-bye.
But it only affects fairly specific expressions. So if you're not using these particular constructs in your code, then you shouldn't have a problem. Of course, there will be a problem that you now have to figure out whether or not you're using these constructs in your code, and that could make things a little bit more complicated. But well, the short answer is a patch and update to the yet latest and greatest version. That would be Struts 2.5.12 and Struts 2.3.34, depending on if you're on the 2.5 or 2.3 branch. At the same time, we are actually seeing exploit attempts against the earlier Struts vulnerability, so that definitely has taken off after the Metasploit module was released. The exploit attempts that we have seen so far appear to be triggered by that Metasploit module, so individual attempts, no big kind of worm at this point, but we all know that's coming next, and that's probably going to show up within the next few days. Still, I'm seeing enough of these exploit attempts where I would say if you are running a somewhat higher profile website, someone probably already tried this particular exploit against your site. So again, before you update or as you update, make sure that your site hasn't already been compromised. And I usually don't cover a lot of breaches here because there are just too many of them, but we do have one that's quite significant that was made public today, and it affects the U.S. credit bureau Equifax. Equifax apparently got compromised, and with that, information for 143 million US consumers was leaked. Now, this is significant not just because of the scale of the breach, but also because it does affect one of the credit rating agencies where people usually are being provided with free credit monitoring if their data was leaked in just such a breach. It's not really clear yet at this point how Equifax will react to this. There is some word out there that, well, you'll get free credit reporting with Equifax, which of course you may have gotten already because of a breach that you were subject to in the past. Intruders apparently had access to social security numbers, names, addresses, birth dates, driver license numbers, credit card numbers, essentially all the data that credit reporting agencies usually have access to. Where credit card numbers weren't really such a big deal here, only 200,000 of those got leaked, probably from users who use credit cards to pay for services with Equifax during the time of the breach. In the end, I don't think that really substantially changes anything when it comes to these type of breaches. You should assume that your social security number, your birthday has already been leaked in one of these many prior breaches we had so far. If you're adding up all the breaches, essentially what you end up with is that every individual's data has been leaked at some point. Now, this breach was announced after the stock market had closed in extended trading. The stock then fell 13% from its high today. Now, on Wednesday, I talked about the MasterCard Internet Gateway Services flaw. Now, in this particular case, there were problems in how these validation hashes were exactly calculated. Part of the issue also was a hash extension flaw, which is actually quite common and often not quite well understood by developers. You're essentially at risk of this particular vulnerability whenever you simply take a secret, concatenate it with whatever data you want to verify, and then hash the result. An attacker can just add appropriate padding and then append additional values to whatever data you're hashing here and still end up with a valid hash. Adrian has a great write-up about this particular flaw and how to exploit it. So if you are dealing with this problem, take a look at his diary for more details. Well, it's a Friday again, so I got with me another STI student. Matt Hosberg is here with me. Matt, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, good morning, Johannes. My name is Matt Hosberg. I'm a cyber threat hunter for a company called Radian, who's based out of Philadelphia, and they specialize in credit enhancement services such as mortgage insurance for home buyers. Recent STI graduate student, so I just completed everything back in July, and I'm very, very thankful to be done at this point.
That sounds great. So now you have time for a lot of extra fun, and we'll talk a little bit about one of your research papers, which was sort of around the idea of threat hunting and, well, how to use sort of deception as part of this. Can you explain a little bit how this all fits together and what you talked about in your paper?
Yeah, no problem. So the premise is leveraging offensive countermeasures or active defense for threat hunting. And I had two goals of the paper, the research. One was to show the kind of the human element of threat hunting, and then secondly to kind of show how we can leverage that human element for techniques such as active defense. So
active defense, now that of course hopefully doesn't mean that you're attacking back. Can you tell a bit how you used active defense and what this term really means?
Yeah, so maybe to frame it up a little bit better, active defense in the context of threat hunting. So I focused on basically there's 3 A's of active defense, and this is coined by John Strand and Paul Asadorian in a book they wrote several years back. And they basically have 3 A's that are annoyance, attribution, and attack. And for this research, I really honed in on the attribution aspect. So really what I was looking at is how do we identify and attribute an attacker more on an individual level. And so active defense does have an attack aspect to it as well. But again, I was just focused on the attribution section.
Can you give us an example on how you used active defense and how it worked for you?
Yeah, so back to the human element, we all are very, very familiar with breaches and things that happen and massive data loss. And so one of my things I looked at were some of the very, very well-known data loss, incidents that have happened in the past. In particular, if you think back several years to a case with Chelsea Manning, who was a Army private in the Army, leaked hundreds upon thousands of diplomatic cables and army reports, and really the catalyst, I think, for the Arab Spring and even some of the Occupy movements. So I wanted to show that cascading effect that those type of leaks had, but with the premise of trying to find out if there's a way we can decrease that detection delta to kind of find out if there are insiders or potential insiders present. And so what I did with the active defense techniques with attribution is I leveraged a solution they have in there. It's called the web bug server. And all it really is a server that you can deploy on-premise or in a cloud, and you essentially stage documents or emails with a very, very simple web bug, so that when the document is open or a email is open, a callback is sent to that web bug server, and you can track things like the source IP address, the document ID. You can trace back a user agent string to kind of help to confine or have a more succinct list of potential insiders. So what I would leverage is that first stage is kind of casting a wide net. So you could stage these documents within various department shares that might take a little effort to get to, so it's not completely obvious. And then based on any type of callback traffic you would see from it, you could kind of whittle a list down into a more definitive or potential list of insiders with that. So.
Now, this sounds like quite a bit of work, and I know that John Strand, you mentioned him, he came up with ADHD, the Active Defense Harbinger Distribution, I think is what he's calling it. Did you mostly use open source tools like that for it, or what kind of tool set helped you set this all up?
So one of my favorite parts of doing this research was leveraging ADHD and then also Security Onion. And the beauty about these systems, not only can you set them up in a lab environment and test out any type of configuration your mind can come up with, there are also tools that are they're free, being open source, but you can also scale these up to maybe an enterprise level. And so one of the things that I like to always point out is a lot of my research throughout the course of the program, I leveraged Security Onion. So big kudos to Doug Burks and his crew for maintaining that. It's come a long way. And so what I really wanted to do with all of this threat hunting and web bug callbacks was to pump that over into Security Onion, and then basically with the latest version of Security Onion, they've leveraged Elasticsearch and Kibana, and so you can easily and rapidly kind of set up alerts and or visualizations for that data. So very, very cool, I guess, things they're doing in that space, and very easy to enable researchers like me to do some work. So.
Now, one sort of promise of this work with deception and active defense is to reduce your false positive rate, because you're no longer relying really on signatures per se, but you're actually relying on the attacker downloading that particular document. Did you find this true that there were less false positives than you had with other methods, and any false positives still left that you sort of had to weed out manually?
Oh, sure. And so taking maybe a half step back, so threat hunting in my mind is kind of it's the area where you may be doing research or investigating things where there's not necessarily a definitive alert for, and so what active defense combined with that threat hunting is we're really trying to minimize that false positive rate. And so what I found was the more documents that would be distributed, the higher your rate of false positives would be. However, if you would stage these documents as you were casting that wide net into areas where maybe just a curious user opening that document wouldn't necessarily stumble on. This would take maybe some effort, or somebody who was actually looking for particular documents or data within the organization. Now, with that wide net that was cast, and you can kind of whittle the list down from that, I leveraged another tool called Mole Hunt, which is essentially a way to create a unique web bug document per user. And so that in turn could be placed in an area maybe where that user only has access to. And so if that does get leaked or opened or whatever, you have a lower false positive rate. So you can say, yeah, for sure we have a problem and we need to either set up additional monitoring, alert the SOC, or if we have some type of procedure around that, we can. Now, one thing though I would caution is there's a couple things going on with the documents that are opened. Let's say you have a cloud-based system and you have a on-premise system. If that document is opened and beacons back to a cloud-based system, you'll probably see the IP address of the organization. Now, if which may not be an indicator you have an insider, it could just be somebody curious. Now, if you start to see that callback traffic with, let's say, a public IP address, that's a very high indication that that document has been leaked. And even if, let's say, you had a DLP system or some other monitoring in place, it could be another indicator that for sure somebody is circumventing those systems somehow. Maybe they're encoding it, maybe they're exfiltrating it via external media or something like that. So kind of a way to reduce or at least get more visibility into the documents that actually have left the organization.
Now that sounds really interesting. Now, given that you're done with your degree at this point and have plenty of free time on your hand, I guess, after finishing all that work, anything you're up to next?
It's funny you say free time. I don't know how where all that free time goes, but it's like a vacuum. There's always it always gets filled. I would say right now though I'm working on refining our threat hunting program at Radian, so I'll continue on that. But I'm going to probably dive more into the active defense realm and see where I can actually integrate that more with threat hunting. And I guess with all that in my spare time, I might actually try to contribute to the ADHD project. I'm not sure. So
that sounds great. So thanks for your time here and thanks for joining us. And thanks everybody for listening. That's it for today. Talk to you again on